Welcome back to the Career Profiles podcast. It's been a while, but this is our first episode back off our little hiatus over the summer, and it's all about the great Jack Dempsey. We covered him in our Legendary Night series. He was in our finale with his fights with Gene Tunney, and we thought what a perfect way to bring the podcast back after its hiatus by having Jack Dempsey's story and more of the stories that we didn't cover in the Legendary Nights episode. He's a guy that's regarded as one of the greatest heavyweights of all time in the sport of boxing. So you're going to understand by listening to this story about his life and his boxing career why people consider him to be one of the greatest of all time. It's an episode that has always been in the works, like many of them are, because, you know, Jack Dempsey is a guy who many people favour, even though he was fighting, 100 years ago? It's like literally 100 years ago, this guy was fighting, and we're covering this podcast on his life and his times. It's amazing how certain fighters' names and reputations and legends stand the test of time.
Exactly, they do. Jack Dempsey is surely one of them, and you know we're going to go in the ins and outs of how how it all started for him. And it's great to, as you say, it's great to come back with a career profile on the back end of our Legendary Night, and it fits nicely. It was either going to be Jack or Gene, and we decided to go with Jack Dempsey in the end. And yeah, we hope you enjoy it. And as usual, we'll literally take it from the very beginning to the very end. Yeah, just sit back and enjoy.
So we're going to begin on June the 24th, 1895, because that's the moment William Harrison Dempsey, later to be known as Jack Dempsey, was born. The 9th of what was to be a grand total of 13 children to Mary Celia of Scotch-Irish descent and Hiram Dempsey, a one-time school teacher who became a migrant miner, railroad worker and farm worker. Jack was named after President William Harrison because naming children after presidents, well, it was the fashion back in those days. Together they travelled west from West Virginia in a prairie wagon in the early 1880s. Jack recalled, "My father, Hiram Dempsey, was a descendant of Irish immigrants from County Kildare. He lived in Logan County, West Virginia, widely known as Feud Country because of the pistol packing, troubleshooting Hatfields and McCoys. Hiram was the nephew of Devil Ans Hatfield, whose motto, 'Boys never kick a cripple or go to bed with a fool,' was passed on to his favourite nephew. Very little else was passed on." Now, Jack's grandfather, Big Andrew Dempsey, was once the sheriff of Logan County and somehow managed to acquire several hundred acres of timberland while raising his 5 sons, of which one of them was Hiram, and he was the oldest. They met in Logan County but first settled in Manassa at the southern tip of Colorado in the San Luis Valley, a farming area near the New Mexico border surrounded by the Rocky Mountains. They joined a community made up of mostly Mormon converts from the south after hearing a preacher from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints which promoted the virtues of the church. Jack recalled, "By 1895, my parents were veritable old-timers, completely at home with a small farmhouse filled with children of every size and shape. In the centre of town, the settlers had built a great white Mormon church, in which I was later christened when I was 8 years old. Up to that time, it was the biggest building I had ever seen. Its steeple pointed towards the sky."
Well, the Dempseys did not stay in Manassa for long, despite the hospitality of their new Mormon neighbours. They would travel whenever Hiram would have enough of the town or a city, and was described by Jack as a dreamer and an egotist, whereas Celia was known to be the feisty one and didn't take no prisoners. Jack recalled one story that explains her spirited nature at best. Intrigued by a gypsy who arrived in town, Celia decided to get her fortune told, and this is what Jack explained and what happened next. So the gypsy, seeing live bait, lit up, finding that my mother had a silver dollar. She borrowed it to put under her tongue to help the spell. Before the spell could be helped, the silver dollar disappeared. My mother, nobody's fool, demanded her coin back, and the gypsy didn't move. So my furious little mother put her hands around the gypsy's throat and threatened to choke her, either standing up or upside down, unless the money was returned. And of course it was, fast. Now, it was Celia that introduced Jack into the life of a boxer. after she was actually given a book as a thank you gesture from a fellow traveller. And Jack said the book was Life of the 19th Century Gladiator by John L. Sullivan himself. Jack said his mother told him, I read and reread this book so many times, son, that right there and then I decided that if you turned out to be a boy, you could be just like him, because I felt be strong. I just knew it. Well, the Dempseys would be off again, and they headed for the 6th highest peak in Creed and Uncompahgre, Colorado, where they ran into trouble when their horse actually died. Jack, his sick mother, the younger siblings actually split from his dad and the older family members due to the high altitude and the freezing cold conditions.
After a short stay in Denver, and when his mother was feeling better, they rejoined the rest of the family in Steamboat Springs, Colorado. The elder boys, including Jack, who was now 9, were hired as farmers, helpers, to bring in more income, but Celia always made sure her kids attended school, wherever they lived at the time. Jack didn't take too well to school, but worse than that were the mornings before it, and he recalled, I hated getting up in the pre-dawn hours, realising that before we could even think of getting breakfast, the cows had to be milked, the wood chopped, horse manure cleared away and eggs collected. No chores, no food. The Dempseys were happy and settled, but then Jack's dad lost his job on the farm, so the family were forced to uproot and leave for another town once again. Jack remembered this move being the hardest, and he said, I think this was the first time I ever saw my mother in tears. I didn't realise that her tears were also being shed for her marriage, which was slowly turning sour. They had many stopovers during their pilgrimages, but their next was a gun country in Montrose, named because every child was taught how to hold a gun from the time they started to walk. Of course, this was when Jack was taught how to handle a gun, and was given his first shooter while learning how to set traps for bears and coyotes. The family began to lay their foundations in Montrose, with Hiram getting a job at the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, and Celia, who knew how to cook, deciding to go into the restaurant business. Jack recalled that Celia Dempsey's Rio Grande eating house was christened with a jug of hard cider.
Well, Jack helped out in the restaurant, from mopping the floor, washing the dishes and shining shoes, as well as selling the local newspaper. He enjoyed watching the construction workers while they gambled, drank whiskey, smoked and swore. When construction of the Gunnison Tunnel was completed, several people, including the Dempseys, they left town again. The family used the money from the sale of the Rio Grande eating house to finance their next move. Eventually, they arrived at Lakeview, not too far from Utah Lake, where Jack's father rented a 120-acre farm. While staying at Lakeview, Jack restarted his schooling and afterwards worked in a nearby barbershop, once again shining shoes and sweeping up. Dempsey, now a teenager, remembered that these were my formative years, my longest years, and they were the years while I waited impatiently to grow up. My older, bigger brother Bernie had become a prize fighter, taking on bouts whenever his money from mining jobs ran low. He alone knew of my ambition to become a fighter and decided to teach me a few professional tricks of the trade. He took me seriously, despite my being only 15, and he dedicated long hours to my training. Maybe he wanted to see for himself whether or not I was on the right road. I could have told him. Bernie wasn't good enough to become a decent fighter and never really earned any money from it, but he saw something in his younger brother. So they turned a chicken coop into a makeshift gym. An old mattress was used for wrestling and a heavy bag, while a cloth bag stuffed with sand and sawdust was made into a punching bag.
Their younger brother, Johnny, would also join in, and Jack said, Johnny and Bernie would alternate swinging a broom in front of me while I tried to hit it as it flew through the air. We took turns skipping rope to improve our wind. We would even sprint against one of our horses. This was supposed to improve our wind and our legs. At first, it only improved our appetites and our horse. Even after endless hard work in the coop, the young, small and skinny Jack Dempsey didn't see any improvements in his body shape. Bernie taught him how to strengthen his chin by chewing pine gum straight from the trees and soaking his hands in beef brine that he said made his fists as hard as iron anvils. Jack recalled, he, as in Bernie, would test me to see if I had done enough chewing by throwing a left hook to my jaw. Invariably, I would be knocked down. After dusting myself off, I would chew some more of the bitter-tasting stuff. I bathed my face in beef brine to toughen the skin. Bernie called it pickling, and I said that if I ever got cut, I wouldn't bleed. Jack worked hard in the coop and in school, eventually graduating from the 8th grade. With what Bernie had taught him and minimal education behind him, Jack decided it was time to leave the family home and tackle the big wide world on his own. He remembered fondly the day he said his goodbyes, and in his words, I can still hear her, as in his mother's, words. Remember, dear boy, if the truth should ever stand in your way, that will mean you're heading the wrong way, and don't you forget it. Ma, go son, go, and God bless you, Harry, God bless.
So Bernie was now a shift boss at a copper mine in Bingham Canyon, Utah, which got Jack his first serious mining job when he was just 16 years old. He was the lowest member of the mine crew, but the job paid a lot of money for at the time and for the low grade he was at, which was actually $3 a day. The decent money came with its dangers, and Jack almost became a cropper one day, going 3,000 feet underground alone. He thought he was going to get blown up when he heard a hissing noise, but luckily it turned out to just be nothing. However, the panic and fear he endured that day would help him going forward in boxing. That's what he said. And the comparison of losing your life in a mine to fighting in a ring was second to none. So while working in the mines, Jack became restricted to fight and have success. However, it was a chance meeting with a local bully that got the locals talking. And he remembered that this tough bully throwing dirt at him. After a few warnings, Jack just lost it. And he said, I started at him, going slowly until I reached the level ground where he waited, swinging his fist wildly. He was completely untrained. I had a distinct advantage despite the fact that he was bigger. We made such a loud commotion that the other miners stopped working and crowded around to see what it was all about. Some took bets, others yelled for us to stop. We started circling each other, neither landing a blow, until I threw a right cross to his jaw that ended it. Well, the news spread like wildfire among the miners, and Jack had finally stepped out from his brother's shadow as the fighting man of the family. For the next 5 years, he would continue to work in mines, hop onto freight trains by riding the rods from town to town, and spending many nights with the hobos while fighting.
Records suggest that by the time Dempsey was 19 years old, he began fighting professionally under the name Kid Blackie in 1914. The skinny teenager hardly sparked fear when he strolled into a western saloon filled with rowdy, hard-drinking miners, cowboys, railroad workers, and other hard men of the day, and in his high-pitched voice, which he had inherited from his father and found embarrassing, would challenge anyone in the house to a fight. He got this idea from reading into the John L. Sullivan book which his mother had given him, who, 3 decades earlier, had walked into saloons and challenged anyone by saying, I can lick any son of a bitch in the house. Dempsey remembered, my best bet would be to walk into a gym, announce the grand arrival of Kid Blackie, and add that I was willing to take on anyone. He would then use his own battle cry, I can't sing and I can't dance, but I'll lick anyone in the house. Now, after an unfortunate soul took up the challenge and got knocked out, most of the time with his trademark left hook to the jaw or liver, Jack would pass his hat around after making his own contribution first, and he recollected, it worked more often than not, and I did take on anyone who stepped forward, knocking him down and out as fast as I could. Then the hat would be passed again, and when it was all over, I'd beat it out of there as fast as my legs would go. The times I got licked were pretty rare. When it happened, I would only try harder. Most of the time, Jack would consult with the bartender by asking who the bully boy was in town and offer to bash him up. He would recite many other bars as references and recommend that they check it out for themselves.
Well, some of those bartenders, they would research his claims, but others he managed to convince after a quick demonstration of shadowboxing. In turn, they would sanction a no-holds-barred brawl in their sawdust-covered floors and watch on as Kid Blackie would knock out his opponent. Jack continued to travel from town to town in Colorado, Utah, and Nevada, and recalled that I was lucky to land a job as a porter in a hotel in Utah for free room and board. I stayed there a while, but pretty soon there were no decent opponents left. Many were on their way east, which was too much of a big step to take at this time. So he continued his journey on those dangerous rods, and he said that sometimes it got real cold under the train. You'd be hanging on with your eyes shut to avoid the hot blinding cinders and trying to keep warm at the same time. It wasn't easy, especially when exhaustion set in. When that happened, I would tie my hands and feet using anything from light chains to heavy cotton handkerchiefs to the train's lower rungs, making sure the knots were tied as strongly as I could make them. If the records are to be believed, then Jack Dempsey made his professional boxing debut on August 17, 1914, when he fought an 8-round draw with a fighter named Young Herman in Ramona, Colorado. However, Dempsey would say years later he started fighting for money in 1911 when he was only 16 years old, and estimated by 1916 that he had already competed in 100 fights, almost all of them in Colorado and Utah, and most of them for purses that rarely exceeded $50. It was also around this time that Jack began to keep records of his victories and how long each one took. So the number of fights he had before his recorded debut was printed and people believe, well, it's basically anyone's guess.
Salt Lake City was one of the better fight towns, and it was there that Jack met a local promoter named Hardy Downing, who ran a boxing club. He managed to convince Hardy to put him on his Monday night card, where he knocked out Kid Hancock in just 12 seconds. When Jack went to Hardy Downing to collect his winnings of $5, he was handed $2.50 and he asked, "Say, what's the big idea? What happened to the $5?" Hardy responded, "Sorry, kid, that's all you get. You put Kid Hancock away far too fast. You didn't give my crowd out there a good fight for their dough, and that's not the policy around here." Disappointed and in need of money, he was offered the chance to earn the rest by fighting Kid Hancock's brother, and he accepted and knocked him out and got paid in full. He then suggested that he stick around, where he fought Jack Downey in April of 1915 and fell then to his first defeat. They would go on to fight 3 times all in all, and Jack reflected on those bouts, and he said, "As we fought, Downey smiled with confidence. He blocked nearly all my blows, exhausting me. By the 4th round I was beat, and Downey rightly got the decision. Our next bout ended in a draw. In the 3rd and last bout I managed to knock him out. Incredibly, he smiled when he kissed the canvas." Jack arrived in one of his old towns, Montrose, and bumped into a former school friend, Fred Woods, who persuaded Jack to fight him in front of an audience during Fair Week in the local Moose Hall. Before the fight began, he began practicing new fighting techniques, and Jack recalled, "From a low weaving crouch that made me harder to hit, to variations of all the blows I already knew, including the powerful left Bernie had shown me."
There you go. Bernie showed him that tremendous trademark left hook. Jack earned $40 in a one-sided fight, as Jack recalls. "In the end, I won, but Fred gave me a good fight before he finally kissed the sawdust. When it was all over, I had to pour a bucket of ice water over him to revive him." His next opponent was Andy Mauler, who was also knocked out, but he would go on to become his first manager after a verbal agreement was after he always did his business. However, their partnership was brief and they split amicably because they just couldn't make enough money and get the fights they wanted. Jack gave credit to Mauler, even though their partnership was brief, and he said, "I learned many things from my manager, Andy Mauler. I learned to make my body a complete unit, the muscles of my feet, legs, waist, back and shoulders all contributing to the power of my arm. He taught me, in short, that my entire body was at stake in the ring, not just my fists. He was a good teacher." Following their split and in need of money, Dempsey went back to mining, lifting, pulling, moving a heavy load and using a pickaxe hour after hour, day after day, with no sun and no adequate ventilation. As we know, it's what the mining game is. That was until his foreman actually recommended that he go back to boxing and that he would still have a job with his crew if it all failed. And that's exactly what he did. He went back to riding the rods and traveling from one mining town to another, looking for fights. While doing so, he was accompanied by a friend, the Denver sports editor and wrestling promoter, Otto Flotto. One day, they went to a mining town in Colorado where Otto had arranged for Jack to take on a few miners, one after the other, all in one night. The fights, as you can understand, were hard going, and by the end of the night, Jack had knocked out all of his guys, but he was very fatigued by it. But it was all worthwhile, as they earned several $100s. It was his biggest pay to date. And Otto, well, he stashed all that money away in his suitcase.
Now, Jack remembered what happened after his fights, and he said, "It was dusk when we finally left town in Otto's car. Heading towards Grand Junction, we were stopped by 4 mounted, masked gunmen who blocked the road. Menacingly, they dismounted and walked towards us, their eyes glittering in the dark. They were eerie and strange in the dim moonlight. The ringleader motioned us with his pistol. 'All right, let's get out of that machine, nice and easy. Put your mitts over your heads.' 'Right, attaboy, you too, kid. Now don't try and make a move or nothing, 'cause we've got you covered, understand?' As if Otto and I didn't know. We were reduced to the status of paralysed meatheads. There we stood, like hypnotised owls blinking into the gaping barrel. It was too much, especially when I heard the hammer click. I guess Otto heard it too, for he immediately shut his eyes. Mine wouldn't dare close, even for an instant. The leader motioned us to hand over Otto's briefcase. One of the others opened it, took out the money, handed it to the ringleader without even bothering to count it, and threw the briefcase back at us. 'Thanks, chumps, it's really swell of you.' They laughed and then backed away. Jumping onto their horses, they rode off. One of them, a real clown, shot his revolver into the air, sending us into the dirt. When we finally managed to get up, we looked at each other in disbelief. After all my hard work fighting all day and into the night, we had nothing left. Nothing. I felt like a fool. Sure, we had been outnumbered as well as taken by surprise, but still. Dejected and skint, they went to a bar at the Grand Junction Hotel, and as luck would have it, they bumped into the guys who had just robbed them.
What an absolute sat. Well, Jack clearly he was fatigued, but he was still fuming and filled with rage. So this is what he remembered. He said, "Before I had a chance to think, I found myself leaping through the air, landing right on top of them. Taken completely by surprise, they didn't have a chance to reach for their guns as I punched with fists and feet until all the fight was out of them, making sure of getting my money and their guns before grabbing them one by one by their seat of their pants and tossing them out the door." Otto, who had sat like a stone through the entire spectacle, now patted my soaked back, telling me that I might have been killed if I hadn't have taken them by surprise. He was absolutely right. At the time, I had been so blinded by fury that I hadn't considered what could have happened to me. I slid to the ground, exhausted. Well, not long after that incident, Jack was, who was still fighting under that name, Kid Blackie, finally acquired that name, the name we all know him as, Jack Dempsey. And it was his brother, Bernie, who actually fought under the name taken by the great old Napari, as in Napari Jack Dempsey. Bernie was booked to fight a middleweight named George Coplin in a tough Colorado mining town of Cripple Creek on November the 19th, 1915. But on the day of the fight, he told Jack, now 20 years old, that he couldn't go on. He couldn't take the fight. And Jack recalled that he never explained why. He didn't have to. As I figured it, he was starting to feel past his prime, now 40, and didn't want to risk failure in front of his co-workers who had come to see him that night. It was a $50 guarantee. So, of course, he filled in for his brother. But the promoter, well, he was angry. He apparently threatened to kill Jack. Bernie forgot to inform him of this last-minute change, and he demanded, "Who the hell are you? Where's Jack Dempsey?" Which Jack Dempsey replied, "I'm Jack Dempsey, sir." And at that point, well, the bell rang.
Dempsey floored Copeland a half dozen times in the first round and twice in the second before the referee stopped the fight in the sixth, or some other sources suggest the seventh round. After the fight, Jack discovered that he had fought for nothing due to his brother spending almost all the $100 purse he had received in advance. The next day, Bernie went back to work in a silver mine, while Jack climbed aboard a freight train and headed for Salt Lake City, where he fought twice. From there, he arrived in Goldfield, Nevada, and began training at the Northern Bar, formerly owned by gambler and promoter Tex Rickard. While in town, Dempsey, now a 160-pound middleweight, met a promoter he called Jack Something, and who'd promised him good money if he would team up with him. After a couple of decent fights, one against Johnny Sudenberg, where Dempsey came away a little worse for wear, he went to collect his earnings, but lo and behold, his new promoter had gambled all the money away and fled town. Dempsey recollected his frustration at this moment, and he said, "I was burning with rage. If Jack had walked across my path that very second, I would have beaten the daylights out of him. He made a damn fool out of me. Again, I had subjected myself to poundings and had nothing to show for it again. I was getting sick and tired of the same tune." He probably felt like leaving town, but he decided to stick around and persevere. His determination was rewarded when he got a rematch with Sudenberg, and he earned $150, and by the sound of things, it was a right barnstormer, the fight. Jack and Johnny struck up a friendship, and for a while put on a few exhibitions in Reno, which received good publicity from the local press, before they went their separate ways.
Well, Dempsey's first knockout of the Boston Bearcat, apparently this guy was renowned for going the distance with Sam Langford, gave him more notoriety and actually boosted his confidence after the palaver he had with his promoter and manager running away. And with that, he actually asked Hardy Downing if he knew of anyone who could manage him, and he suggested Jack Price, his brother-in-law. Dempsey now felt ready to head east to New York. So he sat down with his new manager to discuss the logistics of such a trip in Maxime's Saloon cum Cabaret in Salt Lake City's Commercial Street. Now, Dempsey actually recalled this significant moment in his life, and he said, "Price and I sat down to work out the details of our trip. Whenever anyone glanced in our direction, Price assumed they were looking at him, and he would puff out his chest and look important. He begged me to pay attention, but my eye kept wandering to the piano player, who was giving me the come on. I was flattered that a talented woman could be interested in someone like me. I excused myself and walked over to the piano, and the lady he spoke to was a lady went by the name of Maxine Cates. And after a brief conversation, they went their separate ways, but would meet again. And further on in the story, we'll go into what happens next with those two. But the next day, Dempsey bought his very first train ticket and was accompanied with Price. And they headed off to the Promised Land. They arrived in New York City during the summer of 1916. And Dempsey recalled that first day I visited almost all the New York sports editors to let them know I had finally arrived in case they were interested. They really weren't. In fact, they couldn't have cared less. Then it struck me that the city must have been full of young hopefuls like me. He naively showed them his newspaper clippings, which revealed his 26 knockouts and one against the great Boston Bearcat, the guy who went the distance with Sam Langford, and he thought everybody knew. But the response was the same. "Listen, kid, no one here ever heard of the Pug or of you either. Why don't you just head back home?"
The only writers who did show any interest were Jim Price of the New York Press, who assigned a young Nat Fleischer to interview Jack. But the one thing Jack always remembered was when he stood alone in a hallway of the New York American when he was approached by Damon Runyon, who told me not to give up. And the important thing to remember was to keep your mouth shut and never let on to anyone what you really feel deep down inside, since no one really cared or had time to listen. Dempsey was grateful for the advice, saying his words meant a lot to me. Around this time, Runyon was just one journalist among many. He didn't become the superb journalist of Broadway until years later. Runyon then convinced Tom McArdle, a matchmaker and good friend of Billy Gibson, to book Dempsey a fight at the Fairmont Athletic Club. Dempsey's first fight in New York was against Andre Anderson, who came out of the Fairmont Athletic Club and was managed by Gene Tunney's manager, Gibson, and was 55 pounds heavier. He failed to get the knockout he desired, but he took a newspaper decision, and Damon Runyon wrote that he looked very promising, and with the right training and management he could get to the top. Dempsey was left disappointed with his New York debut, but he must have impressed because his purse was increased almost 3 times more, up to $43, against Wild Burt Kenny. Once again, Dempsey could not find the knockout punch against him, but he floored Kenny twice and took another clear newspaper decision. Things seemed to be improving for Jack, who had been spending nights sleeping on the benches in Central Park and feasting on the free lunches that were offered in many Manhattan bars as long as he bought a 5-cent beer or two.
Wow. Sleeping on the benches of Central Park. Incredible, isn't it? Well, his New York dream was becoming a reality. He's now training at Gup's Gym on 116th Street. And as he recalled, he said, there I gained valuable experience as well as insight, since many of the well-known heavyweights and promoters often came in and gave out 3-pointers and advice. But his slow rise hit a stumbling block when Jack Price was passed some bad news by telegram informing him that his mother was seriously ill in Salt Lake City. Price immediately obviously returned home by train, leaving Dempsey without a manager and alone now in Manhattan. So Dempsey recollected that a few days after Price left, I was approached by John Riser, aka John the Barber. And John the Barber, who had gotten his name from a Broadway barbershop, was a shifty character. He was known around town as a slick operator and a gambler. Many said he would have sold his mother's blood for money if the price was right. Well, John the Barber had very little experience in the sport, but he approached Dempsey at Gup's Gym in Harlem, informing Jack that he had bought his contract from Price for $50 and had also borrowed Price another $50 for his train fare home. This, of course, was a load of old nonsense because no contract had ever been signed. Dempsey recalled the conversation between the pair. He said, "What's this? I never had a contract with Jack Price. Sorry, kid, a deal's a deal. Here's some dough. Go out and buy yourself some decent clothes. You look like a goddamn bum." I protested, but he told me I would have to fight for him whether I liked it or not. I really didn't have a choice. And the fights that were offered to him, his first 2 fights, were Sam Langford and Gunboat Smith. But Jack Dempsey may have been a newcomer to New York City, but he was not daft and he refused.
The Barber became annoyed with his young fighter. He was ready to exploit and made his last offer loud and clear. "Listen, you punk, I'm giving you one more chance. You fight John Lester Johnston next week. He's good, and that's what you want, right? Now don't give me any of your lip. If you don't fight him, you fight no one, see?" Dempsey also knew this was the best offer he was going to get, and he said, "I feared getting blackballed. It could have ruined me." So he took the fight. The bout was held in the Harlem Sporting Club, and Jack Dempsey was told that he would be getting 25% of the total gate receipts. During the Lester fight, Dempsey was put down with a body blow which broke a couple of his ribs, but he managed to recover and valiantly fought on to eventually get a draw. Dempsey said after the fight, "I was through for a while, both physically and mentally. I had been overmatched and hurt, and I was being treated like scum by the Barber. I knew I had to stop fighting for a while." John the Barber paid him $100 for the fight, but Dempsey was baffled and he asked, "What about the gate receipts?" Barber, becoming annoyed, replied, "What about them? Listen, you get what I pay you, and let this be understood once and for all. Am I making myself clear?" Before Jack left, the Barber told him, "Go and get your rest, but don't forget to come back. Remember, kid, we've got a contract." With the money, he bought some clothes, but travelled to Colorado by riding the rods with 3 broken ribs for a friend's wedding. On the way back, he hooked up with Maxine, the piano player we mentioned earlier.
Well, after a very short time, Jack reminisced and he said one thing led to another, and pretty soon Maxine was discussing marriage while I was idiotically agreeing. She was insistent. I couldn't see any reason why not, and before I knew it, we were man and wife. She was 15 years older than I and quite an experienced woman, even though she denied it. An experienced woman is quite funny because comes out later that she is actually a prostitute. It was all sweetness and light for a while, but then their relationship took a turn once they got married. And Jack told her that he wouldn't be around much while obviously he tried to get his boxing career to the next level. He gave his new wife some money, which will be always an issue. So he does give her money. So he always make a point when he finds her, he gives her money, left Salt Lake City and headed to New York. The first person he was greeted was by none other, the Barber. But Jack recalled this time, I had regained my strength, had patched together my pride. I knew exactly who I was, what I wanted to be, and for whom I was well matched, as well as who I couldn't take on, no matter what the price. He's basically saying he'll fight certain fighters, but he knows his limit. He told the barber he was ready to fight again, and then that arsehole promoter, well, he advised, you may have to take a licking, kid, but there'll be real money in it for you if you do it the way I say. And Jack rebuffed the offer. He said, I don't want that kind of money. I want a good, honest fight. Who's my opponent? The barber replied, Gunboat Smith. Dempsey protested again. I won't fight him. I can't fight him. What are you trying to do to me? The response was clear. You won't fight him? You say, listen, you punk. It's either him or no one. Just like I told you before. Jack, well, he stood his ground. But a few days later, the barber returned with another offer. I've arranged another match for you. Frank Moran. This should get you into the big time.
Frank Moran was even tougher than Gunboat Smith, and Dempsey wasn't going to be fooled. He refused, and the response, well, it was expected. Either fight this guy or get the hell out of town. If you don't fight, I'll make it impossible for you to fight in this town, or for that matter, any goddamn place else. Jack slammed the door in his face, ending their short and heated relationship. Well, so he thought. A determined Jack stated, I couldn't wait to leave. I had put all my hopes and dreams into New York, and now I was being driven out. But I vowed I'd be back, even though I didn't know when or how. His first stop was Philadelphia, where it was impossible to get any fights. A certain John the Barber, well, he made sure of that from the promise he made to Jack. He then rode the rods to Kansas City after hearing that Frank Moran was looking for sparring partners. They turned him away due to his small frame, so Jack approached his next opponent, Carl Morris, and he convinced him to take him on, earning 75 cents, not including bed and board. It didn't last long. While in the canteen, Morris ordered a steak with all the trimmings, and Jack hoped that he would offer him dinner. After all, he was his sparring partner. Jack remembered. He ignored me, devouring the food as if he hadn't eaten in months. Then he turned to me and said, Listen, kid, why don't you get someone to buy you something to fill your belly and quit staring at my grub? I'm sure you can manage to hustle someone. Angry and humiliated as I felt, I rose and said, So long. I hoped he would have choked on his food. To make matters worse, Jack's suitcase, which contained his New York suit and a pair of tights and shoes, went missing. Not a great moment for him there.
You've got to give him his dues. He's not going through some shit, and he's still in there, isn't he? Still going. What, 21? Well, at this point, he must have wanted to give up boxing altogether. For some reassurance and much needed support, he headed back to Salt Lake City to hook up with his new wife, Maxine. But she wasn't interested. Not only that, but his family didn't approve of her either. And Jack said, my father called her a slut when I was out of earshot, and my mother figured that anyone who worked in the Tenderloin district of town couldn't be of any good. Well, he was blinded by love or lust, whatever it was. He asked her to join him in New York, but of course she refused. She didn't want to go nowhere. He then received a telegram from a promoter, Fred Windsor, asking him if he would be interested in a fight with fireman Jim Flynn. In the need of the money and a fight, Jack accepted and headed to Murray in Utah, where he linked up with his brother Bernie again. Jack was happier to have his brother in his corner, but things turned sour after Flynn knocked Dempsey down a few times in the first round. And Jack recalled that, I was just about getting my second win when Bernie threw the towel in. I asked, what's the matter with you? Gone daffy or something? What'd you have to go and stop the fight for? What you doing to me, Bernie? His brother replied that, what was I supposed to do? Stand around and watch you get your block knocked off? And Jack, well, he was pissed. He was pissed off for sure. And he said, look, it's my hide. You should have let me go on. I screamed at him. I think that was the first time in my life. Bernie told his little brother, like he said to Jack, look, listen, kid, you're my brother. And I'm probably the only one around here who really gives a damn about you. Let me tell you something, Harry. Even the best of champions get knocked down once. Throwing the towel in don't mean nothing.
He was later accused of throwing the Flynn fight, to which Jack responded to those accusations, and he said, "Some people insinuated that I blew the fight for dough. Dough meant a lot, but it sure wouldn't make me blow a fight." With the fixed claims and his sore feelings towards his brother, he left for Salt Lake City to see his wife again. When he arrived, he showed her the money before falling asleep, and he remembered, "She took the bills without saying a word. When I woke up in the morning, she was gone." A few days later, Fred Windsor telegrammed again from Oakland and said that he wasn't displeased with his showing against Flynn and asked him to join him for another fight. Before leaving, he tracked down and found Maxine and asked her to accompany him. To his surprise, she agreed. However, while in San Francisco, Jack said, she became hysterical, throwing things around the place, screaming at the top of her lungs. She threatened to throw herself out the window while I yelled at her to shut up and tried to find out what had set her off. A frightened neighbour called the police. The minute they walked in, Maxine told them that I had belted her and she could hardly move. I couldn't believe Maxine would lie like that. I just stared at her. The police, having better things to do, told us to settle the family quarrel, but to please keep it down. Things did calm down, and they seemed to be patching up their relationship. But when Jack left for his fight, a non-recorded bout, Maxine disappeared and would never return. Now back to the boxing, and Fred Windsor set up a 4-round fight against the fan favourite Al Norton, and Jack impressed the promoter and the crowd with a draw and said he would try to sign him up for a return match.
Well, before that rematch, Fred Windsor arranged to fight another guy, Willie Meehan, who was a slick fighter who was difficult to hit, which Dempsey discovered and effectively lost this 4-round decision. The Al Norton fight was made 2 weeks later in another 4-rounder, which goes down in the record books as another draw. However, Dempsey believed that he had got the nod when he mentioned it in his book. Irrelevant of the result, Dempsey was dropped by Fred Windsor after that fight because he felt that he just couldn't sell him to the wider public or most of the press. He told Jack he was sorry, but sometimes those who think they're cut out for fighting really aren't. Boy, was he wrong. Without a manager or a promoter to call upon, Dempsey travelled to Washington to work on a shipyard which didn't start for a week. So with time to kill, he sat down in a saloon for a drink, and when he overheard an altercation between two men. And this is what he remembered. He said, the two were holding half-empty bottles and facing each other like a pair of snarling dogs, nose to nose. The guy nearest me was big, beefy lunk, who was surrounded by his pals. The other was a smaller man, very dapper, wearing a vested suit, a diamond stick pin in the necktie, and a flashy ring on the little finger. They didn't look as if they could speak the same language. Both were stinking drunk and could hardly stand up. The smaller guy's face was hard. It was obvious he wasn't anyone to tangle with. Then suddenly a fight broke out with Dempsey sitting bang in the middle of it. And he said, I saw the big guy and his friends gang up on the smaller guy. In my eyes, only cowards pick on someone half their size. So I jumped in to help that little guy out.
Dempsey continued with his story, and he said, I landed a haymaker on the big guy's chin and was pleased to see him dazed. Fists were swinging. I felt myself clobbered from behind. I turned and laid some guys out, and you could hear the thuds, resounding smacks and grunts accompanied by the sound of tables and chairs overturning, mirrors shattering, and the bottles splintering. The saloon was reduced to a disaster area, with the bartender in a flap hollering that he had called the cops and that there were damages to be paid. Well, that's when I walked out. While composing himself, Dempsey could hear the crowd discussing what had happened and that it was Jack Kearns' fault. The name rang a bell, but rather than stick around, he moved on before the police arrived. Not long after, he began work on the shipyard, which were preparing for the Great War, when he was sent a distress telegram from his mother in Salt Lake City. His younger brother Bruce had been stabbed in a street fight while selling newspapers. In a panic, Jack jumped onto a train and headed home, but he was too late. His brother had died before he arrived. Depressed over everything that had gone on, Dempsey was about to look for work in Salt Lake City when he got a letter from Jack Kearns, who was starting to establish himself as a fight manager. Now, we did explain Jack's perspective and the much needed lift that letter gave him when doing the legendary night's Tale of Dempsey vs Tunney, so do please check that out for more information. Now, after receiving a one-way train ticket from Kearns for a trip from Salt Lake City to San Francisco, along with a $5 bill, Dempsey of course hopped on a train to meet his new manager. When he finally met Kearns for what he thought was the first time, he realised then that this was the same guy he had helped in that barroom brawl.
Well, before Kearns could arrange a fight for Dempsey, he needed to get him fed and in shape. So they stayed with his mother, Mrs. McKinahan, who's actually Kearns' real name. And she looked after him like a son. And Dempsey remembered that under his and as in Doc Kearns and his mother's supervision, I came around slowly but surely. I was skinny, 165 pounds soaking wet, and didn't look like much of a bargain. Kearns was about to take quite a gamble, but he told me he knew good championship stuff when he saw it. Once he was in full health, Kearns assembled a makeshift ring to get Dempsey in fighting shape. He then brought in some sparring partners and friends in from the media and the boxing industry to see his new protege. Now, a promoter, one of Kearns' friends named Simpson, was shocked, and he told Kearns, "That's the kid who won a decision over Joe Bond in Nevada." And Joe Bond was actually a Kearns fighter as well at that time. "That's the one you was telling me about. You must be kidding. Why, he ain't worth 2 cents, he said. Kearns argued back, "Well, I think he is. All he needs is a little time." Simpson replied, "All he needs is a little time. Christ, he needs a hell of a lot more than that. What you doing, Kearns? Playing nursemaid to this kid? Why don't you feed him? Wouldn't do him any harm. Maybe with a little weight, he'll be something. Not much, but something." Kearns answered back and said, "Look, listen, Simpson, what would you say if I put the kid against someone like Slapper Willie Meehan?" And his response was, "I'd say you're a damn fool." Well, fool or not, Dempsey had already fought in the Slickster, albeit he'd lost, but this time he won. Although Dempsey himself suggested he lost, he felt that he lost after it, but he did get the decision. Another indication that, once again, records we are given are always contradiction. However, Dempsey would go on to fight Willie Meehan 3 times in the space of a month and finally knocked him out in the first round on September the 19th, 1917.
Sandwiched in between the Meehan fights, he knocked out Al Norton in the first round, which led Dempsey to a fight with the highly ranked heavyweight Ed Gunboat Smith. But it was before that fight that Kearns decided to call out the current heavyweight champion, Jess Willard. He spoke to the San Francisco Examiner, calling out the champ, but then made sure that every copy was placed on a sports editor's desk by the morning. The Smith fight was tough going, where Dempsey was wobbled, but he made it through the 4 hard-fought rounds and assumed he had lost. However, Kearns and Spider Kelly, who was also in the corner, told him he had won and that he was going to be the next champion. It was right after the Smith fight that Kearns got the nickname Doc, and Dempsey recalled, "Whenever he approached me about some arrangement, I had gotten into the habit of saying, 'Whatever you decide is okay with me. You're the doctor.' Well, that nickname stuck, and through the years, I was never able to think of him as anything else but Doc." Dempsey still was now making more money than he had ever made, even if Kearns was at least 2/3, so there was no reason to complain. Now, just as a side note, we mentioned Maxine earlier in the story, how Dempsey would never see her again, but he was sending her money. Now, at this point in her life, she'd actually gone back to working as a working girl or prostitute, and it was very rare that they would cross paths, but Jack, as I said, continued to send her money so she could care for her mother. Now, they would meet again, but it wasn't until 3 years later in a San Francisco courtroom. We'll talk about that in the story later. Now, after winning his last 5 fights in 1917, Dempsey began to attract national attention in 1918 when he won 18 fights, 17 of them by knockouts, with 12 of those ending in the first round. His only loss was to Willie Meehan, the last of their 6 encounters.
So in his third fight of 1918, Dempsey got revenge against fireman Jim Flynn, knocking him out with a crushing right hand from his crouch stance about a minute into the first round. That knockout left spectators to wonder if this could be the same Dempsey who had lost so easily a year earlier, which added more fuel to that fixed fight conspiracy that we spoke about. Now, after the impressive Film victory, Dempsey was able to extend further revenge in his next fight against a guy who we mentioned, Carl Morris, the same guy who had humiliated him when he was his sparring partner. Now, Morris actually weighed in at 235 pounds compared to Dempsey, who came in at 180, and his rival couldn't help himself when he said before the fight, well, if it isn't my little sparring partner. And who's this dude, your manager, sport? Dempsey recalled Doc told him to keep his trap shut and be prepared to pack his gear after the fight. Morris laughed, but Doc laughed louder. Now, in the Dreamland Pavilion, San Francisco, it was Jack Dempsey who got the final laugh, taking a 4-round decision after a shaky opener, as reported in Oakland Tribune. Now, after the fight, Dempsey and Kearns travelled to Denver, where Doc actually seized an opportunity when he actually saw Jess Willard walking alone in the street. And this is what Dempsey recalled of that moment. And he said, this is what happened. He said, not being one to miss an opportunity, Doc leapt across the street, cornered poor Willard, and tried to arrange a match between us right there. Willard looked to me without interest and then looked towards Doc with an obvious distaste. I could tell he couldn't stand him. I couldn't believe Doc's nerve. He not only didn't possess ethics or principles, he had no fear. Willard tried to back away from Doc, but found it impossible. He was too big and Kearns was too cagey. The more Doc talked, the more nervous Willard got.
So continuing with this story, Jess finally told Doc that he wouldn't, under any circumstances, even think of defending his title while the war was on. Doc accused him of placing boxing in a state of suspended animation and of being afraid of losing his title. Willard denied this, so Doc calmed down and made Jess promise, for what it was worth, that I would get the first crack once he was ready to fight again. Jess agreed. I think he would have agreed to anything at this point just to get away from Kearns. Doc relaxed and Willard managed to get away from him pretty fast. Doc then turned to Jack and said, "Learn something, kid. It's only the beginning. Most folks are willing to believe anything you tell them, no matter what. It's all in how it's presented. You've got to sell them good, kid. Make them buy anything and let them think they got the best end of the deal." Did you see the way Willard was cornered? Well, I know he wasn't interested, but I forced him to stay and listen. Now he thinks he's pacified me with that nothing of a promise. Thinks he's made a fool of Jack Kearns. No siree. Just you keep your eye on him from now on, and you'll see who winds up with the short end of the stick. With Willard's promise in hand, Kearns headed to Otto Floto of the Denver Post and convinced him to print the story in hope that the heavyweight champ would buckle to public pressure and fight Dempsey sooner rather than later. Before heading off to Chicago, Jack visited his family in Salt Lake City and was saddened to discover that his father was suffering with severe arthritis, his sister was struggling to look after her kids following the loss of her husband, and both his brothers Joe and Johnny were unwell.
But all this meant that Jack was the sole breadwinner for his family and his estranged wife, Maxine, who, through a friend, told him that she had resumed her music career and didn't want anything more to do with him. It was for these reasons that Jack Dempsey was unable to participate in the Great War, and is something that will be important the further on we go into his profile. Now, Jack linked up with Kearns in Chicago, and they checked into one of the best rooms at the Morrison Hotel. So Jack Kearns told Jack Dempsey, this is what he told him about staying at the plush hotels. He said, "Don't ever check into a crummy joint, kid. People will think that's all you're used to. Remember, in a dump, they're always asked for the dough in advance, while in a classy place, waits until the end of the week or the month. And as we know, kid, anything can happen in that time." Now, while staying at this plush hotel, another plush hotel, Kearns arranged interviews with newspapers and continued to push his fighters' publicity. And when they run out of money, he would borrow it from some promoter or another, with a pitch that Jack Dempsey would be the next heavyweight champion in the world. And amazingly, well, they bought it, and he always convinced them to cough up the dough. Then one day, while they were staying at another posh hotel, Doc heard his name being called. When he turned around, it was an enraged Jess Willard, who was pissed off over the article in the Denver Post. He angrily said, "That was a cheap trick you pulled, Kearns. When I decide to fight again, it will be with someone who had earned it." Dempsey recalled that the scene was so embarrassing that I backed away. Jess was insulting not only to me, but Kearns as well. Willard really incensed Doc before walking away. The whole lobby was staring, and Doc was pretty annoyed at having been humiliated in public.
Kearns sat down and wrote Willard a letter, stating, in effect, that Willard's not wanting to fight me was a disgrace, since the proceeds were to go to charities that were helping boys overseas. It was all bullshit, but Kearns wanted to seek his revenge, and Dempsey said, before he sealed the letter, he showed it to me. I tried to convince him not to send it, but his mind was made up. That's the only way to put that fat, arrogant Willard in his place. One day, Doc decided it was time to get some more publicity, so he called a press conference. When the sports writers arrived, he introduced Jack as the next world heavyweight champion. Then he offered to bet $10,000 of his own money that he, as in Jack, could beat any two fighters of the press's choice in one night. It was a bluff that the press saw through, but the plan worked. They were making the news. Kearns then started inventing stories about Dempsey's strength, his heritage, and his fierce temper, which again were all rubbish, but the press ate it all up. All the while, Jack continued to impress in the ring with his low crouch, fan-friendly style, which made him harder to hit, and along with his aggressive approach, it left many of his opponents on the canvas. He fought all over the country throughout his rise in the heavyweight ranks. In 1918 alone, he fought in 16 states, from San Francisco to New York, demonstrating that he was without a doubt the most exciting and most devastating young heavyweight around. One of his standout victories came against Bill Brennan 9 months before the end of the Great War.
Now, that fight with Bill Brennan, that lasted 6 rounds, with Dempsey able to floor Brennan a few times in the first couple of rounds. Now, by the 6th, Dempsey actually reminisced that he was groggy. I hit him as hard as I could. He spun around and I heard something snap as he fell. The fight was over. I was horrified. The snap had been so loud that I was convinced he had broken his leg. I rushed to his dressing room and found that he'd actually broken his ankle. Now, actually, on the way to his dressing room, when he was rushing to his dressing room, this is what Jack said. He said that as he started down the aisle to go back to Bill's dressing room, just to see how he's getting on, obviously, both sides of the aisle, he heard a word that I was to know for years after that, and that word was slacker. A guy in the middle of the row yelled it at me. When I turned that way, someone on the other side of the aisle said, "Slacker, you were lucky to win." I had been called everything but this. He then said that later on that he actually wanted to die for some years after that, and I wish I had died. He felt so embarrassed about it. Dempsey then fought to what he called a draw against a guy called Billy Minsk. However, some records do suggest he took a newspaper decision. It didn't damage his rise, but it did teach him a valuable lesson, and that was not to underestimate any of his future opponents. Now, following that blip, Dempsey followed up with a succession of first-round knockouts. Then in July 1918, Kearns arranged a fight with one of the best contenders around, who was Fred Fulton. Now, Kearns wanted to make sure that Dempsey was in top shape, so they headed out to Long Beach, New Jersey, and they teamed up with Jimmy DeForest, one of the best trainers around in the business. And Dempsey said that he gave me fine points on hitting, blocking, footwork, and anything else he thought would help me. Criticism as well.
DeForest would remain in the Dempsey corner right up to the Willard fight, but then Kearns let him go, even after Jack protested. The Fulton fight was supposed to be a challenge, but Dempsey was ruthless that night, and he recalled, "Once in the ring, I worked fast, wearing him down till he dropped his guard, whereupon I went straight for the jaw. He was counted out in approximately 18 seconds of the first round." Dempsey and Kearns earned $9,000 for 18 seconds work, but his manager continued to take half the earnings, something completely unheard of. However, Jack Dempsey, the way he saw it, was that he was still earning more money than he'd ever earned, so he never really complained about that thought of Jack Kearns taking half of what he was earning for being in the ring. Now that impressive knockout win placed him in a position to fight Jess Willard, as Fred Fulton was supposed to be his next defence. Therefore Dempsey became the most logical contender. All they had to do now was find a promoter willing to finance a Willard-Dempsey fight. His next 6 wins came against some of the best contenders around, knocking out 5, and they included Jack Moran, battling Levinsky, Dan Flynn, his nemesis Carl Morris and Gunboat Smith, none of which survived beyond the 3rd round. Due to Dempsey's amazing knockout run, Nat Fleischer referred to him as Manassa Jack, but it was later developed by Damon Runyon to the nickname that would last forever, the Manassa Mauler. It was about this time that he filed for a divorce from Maxine for abandonment, which, of course, given her track record, she never contested. The year concluded with Jack being able to buy his mum a house in Salt Lake City, and he fondly remembered sending her some money wrapped in newspaper clippings about her son. After the Fulton fight, the house was completely hers.
Good work. And as always in these stories, when someone becomes successful, people become envious and want a piece of the action, let's just say. And that came in the figure of an old acquaintance of his, John the Barber, who came from out of the shadows to tell or meet with Doc Kearns. He sort of cornered Doc Kearns by the sound of things, and said to him that he had advanced Jack Dempsey some money. The fee he suggested was now $5,000, but of course it was all nonsense. Kearns knew a con when he saw one, because he was basically the king of deception, and replied, "Why, you reptile, you haven't got that kind of dough. Why, you reptile, we haven't got that kind of dough." His response was what you would have expected. "Well, it's either $5,000 or Dempsey. Take your pick." Kearns was advised by journalist Bill Farnsworth to approach the part owner of the New York Yankees. This guy was Colonel Jake Rupert, and to convince him that they were worth bailing out. Now, Kearns, accompanied by Farnsworth, explained the problem to Rupert, and after Farnsworth vouched for Doc Kearns, he paid him the $5,000. This guy could just sell anything. He really could. Kearns then paid John the Barber, and Dempsey recalled that he then told him never to show his ugly face again. Now, with the Barber out of the way and the world heavyweight destiny within touching distance, nothing could stop them now. The double act were a successful story, and they felt they had even enhanced the war effort by raising just under $500,000 for the Red Cross, in addition to selling bonds. Dempsey said, "We were cooperative and tried to help anyone who contacted us." But the notable year in the ring was tarnished by a public relations blunder that hurt Dempsey's image. With the war still in progress, Jack Dempsey, now a public figure, became a target for draft deferment, thanks to Doc Kearns, who agreed to a government request to have photographs taken of Dempsey wearing work clothes and a cap, supposedly at work in South Philadelphia shipyard.
The photographs were circulated to newspapers in the hope of encouraging more people to take war-related jobs. Unfortunately for Dempsey, the full-length photos of him in striped workman's clothes revealed that he was wearing clean leather shoes, which became apparent to everyone that he was not actually working and doing the part for the war effort. The scheme backfired terribly and only succeeded in further casting Dempsey as a draft-dodging slacker. Kearns told Dempsey not to worry, but he couldn't hide his embarrassment. He always protested. "I wanted to go to war. After all, wasn't I a fighter? In my mind, it didn't matter where I fought. I was strong, and I never shirked my duty in life. I wasn't afraid, especially if it meant representing my own country." In 1919, Dempsey won 4 times by first-round knockouts in January alone, and then added 1 more for good measure in February. Then Kearns decided that they needed a gimmick to attract even attention, so they went on the vaudeville circuit. Now, we've gone through this in great detail in the tale of Jack Dempsey versus Gene Tunney, the legendary night's finale for season 3. So please, if you want to hear more details on what they did in that circuit, go and listen to that episode. Now, Doc Kearns' plan was clearly working, but he wanted to push the envelope even more in search of the Jess Willard title fight. Believe it or not, they were lacking funds and actually unable to pay for their expensive hotel. So he told Jack to hold the fort and he left. Dempsey remembered. He was gone 48 hours. When he came back, he seemed a changed man. He told me he'd hooked up with Tex Rickard. The story goes that Kearns had met up with some old pals in New York for a few drinks, knowing that Tex Rickard would eventually show up.
This guy, that is brilliant. Well, so this is Jack's side of the story. So his friend, this is Doc's friend, John McGrew. He actually introduced Doc Kearns to Tex Rickard. And this is what Kearns told Dempsey, and then Dempsey repeated in his autobiography. And it said that, so this is Doc Kearns speaking. He said, "We then got to talking about this and that. And I told him all about you and how I was your manager and all. You know, kid, he had heard your name around New York, see? Publicity, kid, publicity. Anyhow, I told Rickard we were interested in meeting Willard, but he didn't buy it. Said he had the shorts and that he wasn't interested in promoting fights. I think someone told him you weren't too big, because he said something about his not wanting to be responsible for getting you killed. Said the public wouldn't allow it. That Rickard. When I told him I thought we could make big money, his eyes lit up. Sure, I got him all figured out by now. He knows and I know. Fat Jess is no good anymore. He's been out of action too damn long. Well, one thing led to another, and before he knew it, he was sending the champ a telegram. I guess I convinced him when I told him I'd take care of raising the $100,000, the amount we figured that fat so-and-so would accept as a guarantee. Ha! By the time I got through with him, he was convinced I knew that what I was talking about. Yes, sir, you leave it to Doc, kid. Why, I even told him you'll be willing to meet Jess Willard for nothing. And then obviously Jack Dempsey said, for nothing? Was he serious? To Kearns' credit, the plan worked, and Willard responded to Rickard with an answer just a couple of days later, requesting to meet in Chicago, where he then accepted the $100,000 offer. But the question remained, what cut Jack Dempsey deserved?
Tex and Doc argued it out until Kearns suggested that the press help them decide. Dempsey recalled, Rickard offered us $25,000 firm. Doc countered with $30,000. Then it was given to the press to decide. Within 10 minutes it was settled, $27,500. Dempsey was more than happy, more money than he had ever been offered in his entire lifetime, and he said, I glanced at Runyon. He gave me a broad wink behind his thick glasses. That meant it was good, and I was pleased knowing he was pulling for me. Rickard acquired financial backers. The principal investor in the fight promotion was Memphis banker and cotton broker Frank Florinov, whom Rickard had met while raising cattle in Argentina. Florinov's stake of at least $100,000 helped foot the rising stadium bill. Rickard invited the fighters to New York, where they checked in to the expensive Claridge Hotel and met with him at his office at the Garden on 23rd Street. The promoter's doubts about Dempsey surfaced once again, and he told him, Every time I look at you, you get smaller. Dempsey replied, I strip big. To which Rickard responded, I'm afraid Willard will kill you. In New York, Rickard called a press conference and announced that Toledo, Ohio had been chosen as the site for the proposed championship bout on July 4th, 1919. In May, Toledo Mayor Cornell Schreiber, a supporter of the fight from the start, made it official. Rickard could stage a 12-round title fight between Jess Willard and Jack Dempsey at an outdoor stadium to be constructed in Bayview Park. In return, the promoter would have to contribute 7% of gate receipts to Toledo's poor. The fight articles were signed on a ferry boat in New Jersey because it was actually illegal to sign contracts in New York during this time.
Brilliant. Well, Tex Rickard actually managed to construct the arena in Toledo, Ohio, when he signed the papers with the city, expecting receipts of $400,000. Dempsey set up camp in the east of Toledo and brought in sparring partners Jamaica Kid and Bill Tate. He recalled when he was out jogging for his, I think it was 7 a.m. I think he used to go out jogging. I just couldn't believe the crowds that jammed the roads to see me. Kearns asked a guy called John Get Rich Quick Ryan. What a great name. Get Rich Quick Ryan. He was a gambler around town, and he asked him about the odds for a first round knockout, and he was actually given 10-1. Kearns, along with Damon Runyon, put down 10 grand, guaranteeing them $100,000 if it came in. By mid-afternoon, the preliminaries concluded and it reached 114 degrees. Now, due to the railroads, they hampered by a series of strikes and still under the wartime guidance of the federal government, the special trains actually came up short and the city had failed to provide sufficient accommodations. This is what the press said anyway. So the attendance of 19,500 at the Bayview Park Arena was way off the predicted turnout. Most of the sports writers obviously predicted Willard victory, even though he'd been at the ring for a while, but some did pick Dempsey based on his youth and his conditioning. They would be more accurate in their description because this was not a fight in any way, shape, or form. It was an absolute annihilation. And to go into the fight, as soon as Dempsey, 58 pounds lighter, by the way, landed his trademark left hook, which dismantled Willard's cheek and sat the champion on his arse in the center of the ring, only halfway through the first round, the fight was effectively over. Dempsey would go on to floor Willard 7 times in the opener that lasted just 2 minutes and 50 seconds. And the irony of that moment was that after the referee, Ollie Peckard, counted Willard out while down a 7th time, after not being able to hear the timekeeper's whistle, which was actually stopped prematurely.
Dempsey left the ring with Kearns celebrating, thinking they had earned the guarantee plus the $100,000 bet, but they were summoned back to the ring, or Dempsey would face disqualification. The drama could have been avoided if the timekeeper had not made the initial mistake, and Dempsey would have got the first round knockout. But in reality, Kearns and Runyon were 3 seconds away from winning 100 grand. Dempsey recalled the moment and he said, "I'd been champion for less than a minute and had no idea what it felt like. All I knew was that I was once more the contender and that Doc had lost his bet." Willard stayed on his feet during rounds 2 and 3, but his corner had seen enough by then and decided to stop the fight after the 3rd round, leaving Willard sat in his corner sobbing the same sentence, "I have 100 grand and a farm in Kansas." Dempsey described his joyous moment and he said, I won, my God I won, I made it, I am the new champion." However, it wasn't until dawn the next day that his victory finally registered and the new champ remembered. Not realising I'd forgotten to put my shoes on, I ran outside, my heartbeat sounding in my ears. A newsboy was hollering, "Extra, extra, read all about it." "Ain't you Jack Dempsey?" the newsboy asked. "Yeah, why?" I grabbed a paper. There it was, my name in big, bold headlines. I was the heavyweight champion. All of a sudden, standing barefoot on the street with a newsboy at my side, I felt the full impact of my victory. I had the impulse to yell, "Look at me, I did it," but held myself back. I reached into my pockets to give the kid a book, but found my pockets empty. I told him to pick it up in the morning from the room clerk. The newsboy replied, "You don't owe me nothing, champ."
So the immediate talk of Dempsey's first defence began to focus on the French light heavyweight champion at the time, who was Georges Carpentier. And Ring Lardner, who actually lost $500 betting on Willard, said that after what I've seen, if I were Carpentier, I'd stay in France until the new champion dies of old age. Apparently, after becoming the heavyweight champion, Dempsey said he would never defend it against a black fighter. And that's subject to opinion. Some people say he did, some people say he didn't. We must now jump forward many years and address the elephant in the room and the allegations that were made by Doc Kearns in his autobiography, The $1 Million Gate. And we have gone through this with the Dempsey Tunney episode, but we just want to add this as well. So 6 months after Kearns passed away, Dempsey's sympathy for his former manager actually turned to anger when Sports Illustrated actually ran a story. This was in January 1964, claiming that Kearns had put the plaster of Paris on a wet gauze that he applied to Dempsey's hands before he knocked out Jess Willard. Now, this would have made Dempsey's gloves rock hard, as we know, and a far more lethal weapon. Dempsey was obviously enraged with this alleged story, but it became obvious that virtually no one ever believed it. Disbelievers, medical experts, and others also pointed out that had the gauze been placed beneath Dempsey's gloves with plaster of Paris, he probably would have broken every bone in Willard's face and his hands too. And that is also to be considered that he apparently would have shattered his gloves. So we didn't speak about that particular thing, but looking into it for the Dempsey profile, we did, and it seems that this is just not true. Dempsey went on to actually sue the publishers of Sports Illustrated for $3 million. They actually finally settled on an out-of-court undisclosed fee, so we don't know how much they give him, but they did. Sports Illustrated then actually wrote a public apology, wholeheartedly accepting that Dempsey's denial of the charge of the late Doc Kearns. So that's that out of the way. Now back to 1990, and Jack met with his family to soak up his achievement, only to discover that his mum and dad were actually living in the new house he had bought for him, but they were going through the process of being divorced or getting divorced. He headed west and met Kearns in Hollywood, who had agreed for Dempsey to become a movie star. And it was a 15-episode series called Daredevil Jack, and obviously Jack Dempsey would be the star.
Dempsey also participated in vaudeville circus acts and earned more money outside the ring than inside. He would spend 14 months away from boxing, doing everything but fight, except from 2 exhibitions. Living a lavish lifestyle sparked jealousy from his former wife when Dempsey was accused of defrauding the government by lying on an application for a draft deferment during the Great War. His former wife, Maxine Cates Dempsey, had wrote to Harry Smith, a sports columnist from the San Francisco Chronicle, alleging that Dempsey had not supported her financially, as he had claimed in dependency papers that he had filed with his draft board and was indeed a draft dodger. On the back end of that printed story, the pictures of Jack working in the shipyard were again brought to light, adding more fuel to the fire. As we have mentioned already, Maxine was and had been working as a prostitute when she married Jack in October of 1916. Kearns attempted to pay her off with a fee of over $25,000 and a promise that she would stay in Tijuana, Mexico until it all settled down. He even escorted her to make sure she did as promised, but the police stopped them before they could cross the border. Maxine was taken into custody in San Francisco to await the trial, while Kearns was warned not to tamper with the government's witness again. In early June of 1920, Dempsey went to trial in federal court in San Francisco for 1 week. A naval officer named John F. Kennedy, no relation to the President JFK, testified that Dempsey had been in the process of enlisting at the Great Lakes Naval Training Station in Illinois just before the war had ended. Celia Dempsey testified and said, "We wouldn't have had anything if it wasn't for my son."
Well, Maxine said that she had received about $900 from Dempsey in 1918 and 1919, half as much as Dempsey's lawyers contended. But then Dempsey's lawyer, Gavin McNubb, produced 3 Western Union employees from Salt Lake City who testified that Maxine had received many payments by wire from Jack Dempsey. One of the Western Union men said that Maxine had told him Jack always sends plenty of money when he has it. Dempsey was nervous and knew that the outcome of the trial would have a great bearing on his boxing career, along with his commercial endorsements and, of course, the new movie, which was on hold at this point. But much worse, if he were found guilty, he would be confirmed as a slacker and lose his world heavyweight title. Taking the witness stand on the 6th day of the trial before a packed courtroom, a composed Jack Dempsey said he had contributed to the support of his family since he was a teenager working in Colorado mines and at odd jobs and as a fledgling professional boxer. He also insisted that he had given financial support to Maxine throughout their marriage and that, contrary to her earlier testimony, had never struck her or any other woman. Dempsey also testified that he had contributed about $330,000 to various war relief charities during the war. So then on June 15, the case went to the jury, and Dempsey did not have to wait long to hear his fate. After only 10 minutes of deliberations, the jury had reached a verdict: not guilty. The courtroom erupted with cheers. Dempsey smiled for the first time in more than a week and told reporters, "I'm the happiest boy in the world. Now I can start square and not feel that people are thinking that I tried to get out of doing my duty." Despite his acquittal, Dempsey would still be perceived as a slacker and a draft dodger.
The whole courtroom drama also came at a cost. Dempsey said, "Later Rickard told me that the total had amounted to approximately $150,000. But he was still the heavyweight champion, and Daredevil Jack was taken off the shelf, and it was completed." 5 years after the trial, Maxine was killed in a fire where she was working as a prostitute in Juarez, Mexico. A pretty grisly end for what sounded like a bit of an arsewipe, to be honest. Like, the whole part of the story that we've covered has all been about what he tried to do for her. She was much older than him, and she certainly took advantage of him on many occasions. And I think that's kind of, I hate to say it about people, but it kind of feels like a sort of fitting end to to somebody that was trying to ruin this guy's career after it took off. Well, despite her allegations against him, Dempsey was devastated when he heard of her death. Close friends said that he had never gotten over his love for her, and that Dempsey may have still loved Maxine even when she died. Dempsey was now eager to get back in the ring and defend his world title. Tex Rickard would not be a part of the promotion for his fight against Billy Misk, but he did warn Dempsey about the dangers of Doc Kearns, and he advised, "He, as in Kearns, is taking 70 cents out of every dollar you make." Dempsey understood, but continued to trust the manager he considered to be one of the main reasons for his success. His loyalty wouldn't waver. The Misk fight was held at a minor league baseball stadium in the resort town of Benton Harbor in Michigan on Labor Day afternoon, September the 6th, 1920. Harry Greb and Sam Langford both featured on the undercard, but the main event went as expected. Dempsey landed a body shot which knocked the challenger down for the first time in his professional career. Dempsey then landed his trademark left hook to the jaw that put the challenger down. Somehow, he managed to beat the count, but the fight was finished with a right in the third round that put him down for the full 10 count. The champion then helped his victim off the canvas and stood by his side while his corner revived him.
Well, the Bill Brennan rematch was next just 2 months later and was Dempsey's first fight in New York since the summer of 1916. With his reputation tarnished only 6 months earlier and the torrid reception he had 4 years prior, Dempsey was worried about public's reaction when he climbed through the ropes once more. It was evident that the crowd were a pro-Brennan crowd, as from the off, as Dempsey was greeted with boos. In the Madison Square Garden ring, before a sellout crowd just shy of 17,000 on the night of December 14, 1920, Dempsey's timing was off, and while he remained the aggressor, his performance lacked the usual qualities the crowd were expected to witness until the 10th round, that is. Dempsey landed a right-left combination to the jaw, drawing blood from Brennan's mouth and turning the tide in a fight that he was actually behind on the scorecards. The fight finally ended in the 12th, when a body shot from Dempsey sucked the air out of the valiant challenger and the crowd cheered for both fighters. But the champion was honoured to have turned the crowd in his favour. It was a second successive defence of the heavyweight title, and he also took home the diamond-studded belt that Rickard, who promoted the belt, or this bout, had designed. The world champ was not only back, but he had ended the year being a lot more of an active champion than he was before. But it would be another 7 months before he would make his third defence. A fight with George's Carpenter had been discussed several times for over a year now between both camps, but where the fight was to be staged seemed to be the major stumbling block. However, the internal negotiations between Doc Kearns and Tex Rickard were probably the main reason for the delay.
Jack Dempsey recalled in his words, "Each tried to outsmart the other, and Marcel Deschamps, known as the French Fox, tried to outsmart them both. At first, Tex offered Doc a percentage, and he agreed. Then mulling it over, Doc decided that he and I would be better off with a straight fee. It was all right with me. I was to get $300,000. Deschamps readily accepted $200,000 for George's. Everyone was happy. We had no way of knowing that the gate would surpass $1.25 million. Not taking the percentage was one of the few miscalculations Doc made. Kearns tried everything you can imagine to outsmart Rickard, even trying to up the cost by staging a fake business deal with 2 Cuban millionaires that were in fact just a couple of waiters. Maybe we'll have to revisit this fight for our 4th Legendary Night season, because I'm sure there are many more stories that we've yet to tell about this particular fight and the build-up and the shenanigans of Doc Kearns. Well, the real winner of the fight ended up being Tex Rickard, who produced boxing's first $1 million gate, generating over $1.7 million. From that, he paid Dempsey and Carpenter a combined total of over $500,000 and had to repay $250,000, which he borrowed to build the 91,613-seat octagonal stadium in Jersey City, New Jersey. The stadium was built in just 9 weeks on a piece of land known as Boyle's 30 acres. After Tex Rickard would have walked away with about $750,000 and must have loved gloating to Dempsey, he said, "Listen, Jack, the public makes the champion and I'm the public's agent, so tell your loudmouth manager not to underestimate me again." Tex originally had his eye on the Polo Grounds, but when New York's governor tried to impose too many restrictions, the site was quickly shifted with the help of New Jersey political boss Frank Hague. Once again, the fight articles couldn't be signed in New York, so they were signed in New Jersey. Kearns and Francois Deschamps, Carpenter's manager, put up the $50,000 as forfeit money.
Well, Tex Rickard actually put up $100,000 as well of his forfeit money, but actually had to turn to Mike Jacobs for help. And Uncle Mike, well, he knew through the grapevine that this fight would draw well over $1 million. So, of course, he moved fast. He got in touch with the other brokers and investors, promising them the best seats. Soon, Jacobs had actually raised $180,000 for Tex Rickard. Tex, not one to forget a favour, actually thanked Uncle Mike by giving him exclusive selling privileges for the first 20 rows of all future Tex Rickard fights. So he'd actually pay him back, but he offered him, I mean, he could probably earn that back by selling the seats. Dempsey was now set to defend his title for the 3rd time on July the 2nd against Carpenter, whose knockout of battling Levinsky 7 months earlier had helped him gain this shot at Dempsey's title. Jack Dempsey had set up camp at the airport grounds not far from Atlantic City before moving to the main city as the fight neared, and the public flocked to his daily sessions with crowds reaching 1,000 people. And of course, Doc Kearns was there as ever, collecting $1 per person. Oh dear. On the day of the fight, Rickard was unable to control his excitement. Tex Rickard, that is. So he couldn't believe the amount of people from different levels of society that were there. He then gave Dempsey a word of advice just before he made his way to the ring. He said, "Listen, Jack, take it easy on Carpenter. Give the people out there a good run for their money, but be careful. Don't kill him. Don't kill everything." Dempsey was cast as the villain during the promotion of the fight, and the Frenchman was the war hero. So when Dempsey made his way to the ring, he was, of course, booed and jeered by a majority inside that 90,000 arena. When both fighters were in the ring, Dempsey's weight had been announced as 188 and Carpenter's 175. He was a natural light heavyweight, but the champion was actually weighing in at 190, according to his trainer, and the Frenchman was probably closer to 170.
Rather than use a report or other opinions on how this fight went down, we've decided to let Jack Dempsey describe the action. Of course, because he was the man competing in the bout. Now, this was his perspective, and he said, "Carpenter moved into the ring and circled me with a series of jabs. I took it slow. No use rushing it. I had to study his fighting style. In the second round, Carpenter took the offensive, his only real try for victory. He threw a right to my chin that staggered me. I looked at him with a surprise. Could it be that he had been underrated? But he didn't follow through. He had broken his thumb. The crowd was convinced George's Carpenter was going to win. Every time I made it to my corner, I could hear the shouts. 'What's the matter, slacker? The Frenchman too tough for you? Maybe you're washed up. You're soft.' Well, the third round turned the tide. It was brutal. I threw some blows to the face and smashed one to the stomach, making him cover up. A strange silence travelled through the crowd. When he retired to his corner, I could see Deschamps jabbering to his champion excitedly. Just before the bell sounded for the fourth, Doc leaned over and whispered, "Go to it, kid. Get him now." I rushed in and landed a series of blows. A hard left hook sent Georges to the canvas for a count of 8. He managed to get up, but he was finished even though he was still game. He threw a right which I blocked. With some lefts followed by a right to the heart, I sent him to the canvas. He couldn't get up. He raised his legs, but couldn't follow through. The fight was mine. I rushed over to help him back to his stool. Blood was flowing from his nose and from his mouth.
And that was it. Dempsey, what a great description. I think that's one of the greatest ever fight descriptions we've ever had. I love that. Dempsey had made his third successful defence and turned some of the fans back in his favour. However, not all. And he was still going to be continually heckled by many. Once again, it would be a long hiatus from the ring. In fact, it would be 2 years before he actually returned again. He went back to shooting movies in Hollywood and appearing in some touring vaudeville shows. That was until Doc Kearns suggested they go to Europe. Dempsey, Kearns, Teddy Hayes, a friend of his and sort of corner man as well, Joe Benjamin and Damon Runyon, who was, I think, working for the Hearst paper at the time, all set off to sail on the Aquintana. That's the ship. The trip was Dempsey's first on an ocean liner and his first visit to Europe. Out on deck, Dempsey playfully boxed with the children and chatted with their parents and other passengers who were charmed by his warmth, gentleness and willingness to mix it with just about everyone on board. Dempsey and his friends mingled with royalty, high government officials and socialists, among others, while visiting England, France and Germany. While in London, Dempsey stayed at the luxurious Savoy Hotel and went to the races at Epsom Downs, visited Buckingham Palace and saw Big Ben and the Tower of London, and dined with Lord Northcliffe, the owner and publisher of the Times of London and the Daily Mail. And that was it. He dined with him. We went to his townhouse outside London. Dempsey was shown great hospitality in London, but was more comfortable in France, especially Paris. He said, "It was more in tune with our crowd. You should have seen it in 1922, especially if you could have been my age and heavyweight champion in the world. We just had a good time. Lots of cafes, dancing, going to the racetracks, receptions and laughs." Before leaving Paris, Dempsey was asked to compare their city with London, and Dempsey responded, "Paris was better. More girls, more action."
From Paris, Dempsey went by train to Berlin train station, where once again he was greeted by a crowd of about 7,000, which surrounded him as he got off the train. Dempsey was stunned by the reception and their hospitality, but he wasn't impressed with the women's boxing night, and he said, "Women punching women? I hated it." Arriving back in New York on May the 19th, 1922, Dempsey told reporters he was prepared to fight any available contenders, including Harry Wills, the coloured heavyweight champion. He had fought several black fighters on the way up, and probably felt that black fighters deserved the opportunity, and he said he would be glad to accept a challenge from a black fighter, apart from the half-blind Sam Langford. Now, Dempsey revealed years later, "They always said I wasn't afraid of any man. The hell I wasn't. I was afraid of Sam Langford, because I knew he would flatten me." Well, any hope Dempsey and Kearns may have had for a big money fight in New York was ruined on February the 4th, 1923, when William Muldoon, the chairman of the New York State Athletic Commission, announced that unless promoters lowered their purses for heavyweight title fights and reduced prices for spectators attending those fights, there would be no heavyweight title bout staged in New York. He said boxing had become much too commercialised by money-mad promoters and managers, and newspaper coverage of heavyweight fights had become excessive. He also asked, how could anyone justify a heavyweight fighter making more money in one fight than the President of the United States makes in just 4 years? While wondering where they could stage their next fight, an out-of-the-blue offer arrived from James W. Body Johnston and a colleague, Mel McCutcheon, in the late winter of 1923. They wanted Dempsey to defend his title in their town, with a population of just under 1,000, to put Shelby, Montana on the map.
Well, given Muldoon's virtual ban on heavyweight fights at the time in New York, Kearns decided to wire an acceptance of the Shelby offer that guaranteed Dempsey $200,000, the equivalent of slightly more than $2 million today for the fight, which was actually set for July 4th. With not enough money, no venue, no opponent for Dempsey to even fight, they threw the dice this partnership, and they managed to get state politicians and oil tycoons who were sort of living in locally in the area to invest, but they would have their problems. Now, Kearns actually met with American Legion commander Lloyd Malumbi to collect the first $100,000 and also sign a contract. Now, Malumbi was the obvious choice because he was also a lawyer. However, he returned from Chicago with a signed contract, as he was supposed to do. But on that contract, there was a new figure of $300,000 now, or the fight would be off. Now, according to the retired publisher of the Shelby promoter, John Kavanagh, he said that Kearns apparently threw a wingdig of a party and may have got Malumbi drunk and then convinced him to sign the contract. Maybe Kearns provided him with a woman, who knows? Otherwise, why would an intelligent lawyer who had a very strict instructions to offer only $200,000 do what he did? The team of Johnston, McCutcheon, and Malumbi and their backers, they refused to give up. So they continued to persevere, irrelevant of the mountain that they had to climb in a limited time and on limited resources. But they were resolute and decided upon the respected Tommy Gibbons as Dempsey's challenger. Now, when Doc Kearns eventually told Jack Dempsey, because Dempsey didn't even know anything about this, that he had agreed to fight in Shelby, Montana, Dempsey replied that I'd never heard of it. Kearns responded, it ain't a big place, but the money's there. Some oil fellas out there want to put the town on the map and sell some oil stocks. Dempsey wasn't best pleased. He said, I don't want to fight in a place named Shelby. It's crazy. Kearns advised they're going to give us $250 and 50%, suggesting $50,000 less than the offer he had now received.
Yeah, just trying to diddle him out of more money there, isn't he, as well, without even telling him at this point. Well, the trusted Dempsey replied, well, okay, but I'm going to hold you responsible for the money. The next instalment of $100,000 was due on June 15th, but after almost failing to provide the requested sum, Mayor Johnston, through land and oil leases from his estate, managed to cough up a majority and pay Kearns. The fight may have been saved in the nick of time, but the last $100,000 was now due on July the 2nd, or the fight would be off. When Dempsey had initially arrived at a nearby town to begin preparing, he was greeted as a hero. However, the town's locals began to dislike the champion due to what they read in the newspapers. They were not happy about hearing the amount of money Dempsey and Kearns were getting for one fight. Unbeknown to the locals, Dempsey would have fought for much less than Kearns had negotiated, but to them, he was just a money grabber who was earning more than anyone could have earned in their lifetime. His public appeal was quickly diminishing, while the family man Gibbons, who earned nothing and was fighting just for the title, was becoming the fan favourite. The day before the fight, Kearns was informed that only $40,000 had been raised and nothing more could be done, so the fight was called off. Then Kearns agreed at 2:30 a.m. that he would take the remaining $100,000 or whatever was left from the gate receipts on the day of the fight, and the fight was back on. Due to the lateness of the decision to put the fight back on again, the Great Northern and other major railroads cancelled more than 20 special trains from Chicago, Seattle and other western cities, meaning the 40,000-seat wooden outdoor arena that was built in just 4 weeks, it wasn't filled.
He's just destroying this poor little town, and only 7,202 people actually paid the full price to get in, which increased to 10,000 when Kearns cut prices an hour before the fight. He was actually on the gate, Kearns, collecting the money as well. A barbed wire fence while he was there actually collapsed and allowed another 2,000 in for free, taking the capacity attendance to about 12,000, leaving about 28,000 empty seats. Just moments before the fight, Dempsey was actually overwhelmed by an angry mob baying for his blood, and Dempsey recalled in later years that for the first time and only time, I was more worried about getting hurt by the crowd than the guy I was fighting. The fight took place eventually in midday at 90-degree heat and was a 15-round one-sided victory for Jack Dempsey, but he was lackluster and rusty in his performance. The crowd booed the champion, who pretty much legged it out of that ring and out of Shelby altogether, along with his manager and bodyguards, while Gibbons was cheered. The challenger actually left the stadium in his ring attire, walked a quarter mile to the nearby cottage he had shared with his wife and 3 children, and was followed all the way home by hundreds of cheering supporters yelling, "Tommy, Tommy." We did say this in the legendary night as well, but Dempsey's great story. Dempsey may have defended his world title and earned big money, but his reputation once again was taking a battering. Gate receipts actually totaled approximately 80,000, of which the Inland Revenue reportedly took 10%, leaving Kearns and Dempsey with about 72,000, bringing their total purse that they earned to 272. Unfortunately for Shelby, Montana, the event almost bankrupted the town, and the gamble to put the small town on the map never happened. Kearns was not remorseful in any way. He said in the autobiography, The $1 Million Gate, that financial raid was satisfactory revenge on the state of Montana for this early fleecing of my father. They apparently took him for $100,000. I got it back some 45 years later with 200% compound interest.
Dempsey's 5th defence of the heavyweight title came against Argentine heavyweight Luis Angel Firpo, who was promoted by a returning Tex Rickard following his child molestation allegation. Dempsey and Kearns earned just over $500,000, the equivalent today of more than $5 million. The heavyweights were now allowed back in New York, with the fight being hosted at the Polo Grounds on September the 14th, 1923, and generated another $1 million gate, once again involving Jack Dempsey. Now, we have gone through this fight a few times, so please do check out our legendary nights on Dempsey and Tunney and our patrons only episode on the greatest rounds in boxing. Now, this fight is also on YouTube, and you can see Firpo hit that deck 7 times, and then Dempsey gets knocked through the ropes, and this is all in the first round. Dempsey then stopped his bigger and heavier challenger in the second round, but was grilled by the press for his performance and the amount of money he was making. Although still in his prime at 28, Dempsey would not defend his title again for 3 years, but would remain in the public eye while earning over $2 million, most of it from appearing in movies. Dempsey fought only a few exhibition fights, went back to the profitable vaudeville circuit, and lived in Hollywood. While on a movie set, Dempsey once again fell in love. This time it was with an actress named Estelle Taylor. Kearns and Taylor, now Dempsey's fiancée, didn't like each other, and it wasn't long before they would fall out, leaving Dempsey with a difficult choice to make. Now, during a dinner at a Hollywood restaurant, Kearns made some crude remarks about Taylor in a loud voice that could be heard throughout the restaurant. Dempsey was shocked, but said little. Even when Kearns threatened to reveal some scandalous information he claimed to have unearthed about Taylor, who was rumoured to have had affairs with several movie executives who happened to be married. Finally, an irate Taylor and an embarrassed and upset Dempsey left the restaurant.
Well, back at Taylor's apartment, she obviously exploded with rage and furious at Dempsey for not defending her against Kearns' abusive remarks. She gave him a choice: end his relationship with Kearns or she would call off their wedding. Dempsey told her he was through with Kearns. However, their actual breakup would not take place for almost another year when Kearns refused to settle for 35% of Dempsey's future earnings, which had now surpassed $500,000, or as of 1924. So he's still taking half of any earnings, not even just the ring. It's a bit of a absolute piss take. Dempsey was not surprised when Kearns, who now was also managing the welterweight champion Mickey Walker, declined the offer. He would continue to receive that 50% of everything Dempsey earned, including his income as an actor, or, as he used to say, nothing at all. I'll either have 50 or nothing. Well, it would be nothing at all. The most successful boxer-manager relationship in sports history was essentially over, although Kearns would go on trying to collect at least a third of Dempsey's income for the rest of Dempsey's career. In fact, he even tries to sue Jack Dempsey while in the middle of preparations for the Gene Tunney fight. With Kearns effectively out of the picture, Estelle Taylor did eventually become Mrs. Dempsey, or I think it's Estelle Taylor Dempsey or Dempsey Taylor, I'm not quite sure. They got married on February 1925, and the young couple actually took a honeymoon trip to Europe in May. Now, as it was in 1922, Dempsey was warmly greeted everywhere he went. In this case to London, Paris, Berlin, and in Cologne and Vienna was added onto their European tour. During 1925, a boxing promoter, Floyd Fitzsimmons, seized the opportunity in Kearns' absence and managed to acquire both Jack Dempsey's and Harry Wills' signatures on a contract for a fight in 1926. On September 28, 1925, Wills, Dempsey, Fitzsimmons, and investors met for the contract ceremony. Wills received a check of $50,000. Dempsey's check was only for $25,000. Despite the shortfall, Dempsey was still willing to proceed. The next morning, Dempsey accompanied Fitzsimmons to cash the check, but then when they got to the bank, wrote author Rogan Khan reported that Fitzsimmons' account was in fact empty, and the check bounced, and Dempsey walked away. Wills actually kept his $50,000, and that fight just never happened.
Wills, with his manager Mullins, twice attempted to sue Dempsey for breach of contract over the cancelled bout, also during the two Tunney fights, but they were never successful in that lawsuit. In 1926, Wills received another opportunity to fight for the world title for a staggering offer of $250,000, and that was to fight Gene Tunney in a title eliminator, and the promise of a fight with Jack Dempsey. Wills turned it down, believing that he was already entitled to fight the champion. Now, after a 3-year hiatus, Jack Dempsey finally re-entered the ring with Doc Kearns in his corner and fought the rightful next contender in Gene Tunney. Now, we're not going to go through the ins and outs of these two bouts because we have already done this for our Legendary Nights episode, so if you want more detail, again, please go back and listen to that one. If you didn't already know, Dempsey does lose the fight to Gene Tunney by unanimous decision in Philadelphia in a poor performance from him. Understandable after 3 years out of the ring, but an excellent performance from Tunney. Now, in between those famous fights, Dempsey was keen to get in a fight a few months before the rematch with Tunney and shake off any ring rust, so he took on Jack Sharkey. However, on July the 2nd, 19 days before the Sharkey fight, Dempsey was relaxing on the porch at Tom Luther's resort in the Adirondacks shortly before noon when he received a phone call that left him in shock. His brother Johnny, who was hoping for a reconciliation with his 21-year-old wife, had killed her and himself when she refused to return west with him and their 2-year-old son.
Yeah, a heroin addict whom Dempsey had supported or helped support for years after trying to help him get started as an actor in California. Johnny Dempsey had only recently been released following a month's treatment for his addiction at a hospital in Salt Lake City, where a doctor apparently declared him cured. Typical of the days, mainly because of his problems with drugs. Edna Dempsey had broken up with him several months before and took the son with her to stay with relatives. Johnny had followed her in early June, hoping for a reunion with Edna, but his efforts failed. And in that July 2nd morning, the landlady in the rooming house where Johnny Dempsey's estranged wife was actually staying heard loud voices, followed by 3 gunshots. She later told police that she rushed to the room to find Johnny Dempsey dead on the floor and Edna Dempsey shot and wounded. By the time the ambulance arrived, Edna Dempsey was dead as well. After the violent death of his youngest sibling, Jack Dempsey, that is, felt responsible for Johnny's death since he had persuaded him to move to Hollywood. Red-eyed from crying, Dempsey told reporters at his training camp, Johnny wanted to be a fighter. He was a year older than I was and one of the handsomest guys you ever saw. Wonderful personality, smile and all that. He could box as good as anybody, but the second he was tagged, the fight was over. Dempsey managed to recover and go on to fight, and he stopped Sharkey in the 7th round, somewhat controversially, with many suggesting, even Dempsey himself, that his finishing blows drifted a little too south for many people's liking, except, of course, the referee, who just failed to ignore him. 2 months later, Dempsey attempted to become the first two-time heavyweight champion against the new champion, who was Gene Tunney. But he lost by decision in that famous long count fight. Again, look, we're going to refer to a Legendary Nights episode for more details on that. We have gone into so much detail in a near on 3-hour episode, so there's nothing really left to say. But we, as in me and Sean, will have a brief discussion about those fights. I mean, just vaguely, Sean, very briefly, before moving on to the end of Jack Dempsey's profile. I mean, a great performance in the first one from Tunney, terrible performance from Dempsey in that first fight. But, you know, he was out ring rusty as hell. Much better performance in the second fight, knocks him down. We've described it. I mean, the long count fight, Dempsey sort of ruins it himself. Whether Tunney could have got up or not, we never will know. But it is what it is. It's history, and it's still a historic fight. I don't think there is any debate about it now, Sean, is there?
Not from our side, anyway. And I suppose if you're listening to this episode and you've not heard the Legendary Nights episode that we keep referring you back to, it's probably important that after listening to this, you do go and listen to that tale, because, you know, there are parts that are obviously very similar and replicated for the stories and the purpose of the stories. But what you get to find is that we hear more about the tale of Gene Tunney, and you learn more about Tunney in this episode and then what you do really with Dempsey, because you'll have learnt a lot already from listening to this one. And I think what we took away from it was there was a big myth around the long count fight, and after hearing the stories that we sourced for the episode, it was quite evident it was just a moment that really could happen at any time. And we always refer to the modern day version of the long count, which was Fury Wilder 1. And I think that moment when Fury gets knocked down and Wilder doesn't go to the neutral corner, it's in a way very similar to this moment in the second fight between Dempsey and Tunney, although Jack Dempsey doesn't go dancing around like an idiot to the middle of the ring like Wilder does, but he still doesn't do what he needs to do, and that, for that reason alone, it was his own worst enemy that night. And for us, it was just really the making of Gene Tunney and probably the decline of Jack Dempsey in his professional boxing career.
Yeah, and before you move on, I just wanted to just input one thing that one of our patrons, who we love very much, did pick up on a mistake. So I suppose it's a good time to correct it, Sean, was the fact that I think we said that they both retired after their rematch. It wasn't the case. Dempsey does, which we'll go into in a minute, but Tunney didn't. He had one more fight. So it's probably a good time to correct that. That was just a complete, you know, with the amount of information we put in it, we missed probably the easiest bit of detail. So if you did pick up on that, sorry for that.
So moving back to Jack's story, and he did retire after the Tunney defeat with a documented career record of 53 wins, 43 by knockout, 6 losses and 8 draws. And he said, Tex was eager for a third battle, insisting he could get me $1 million guarantee as well. But I wasn't interested. I was afraid for my eye, having been told that if it was damaged again, it would lead to a permanent impairment and maybe blindness. Dempsey hit some rough times after retiring from the ring. After his last theatrical venture in the big fight, Dempsey was hired by Tex Rickard to be his co-promoter on a fight between young Stribling and Jack Sharkey in Miami, where Rickard had recently bought a home and where he had invested heavily in real estate on Miami Beach. Even Dempsey knew that Rickard, with whom he had become close, had hired him to try to draw attention to a fight that had generated little interest. Shortly before the fight, on January the 5th, 1929, Tex Rickard died in a Miami hospital when an infection set in following surgery for a gangrenous appendix, with his third wife and Dempsey at his bedside. He was 59, maybe slightly older, no one really knew for sure. 7 months before he died, Rickard said he was worth about $2.5 million, but after his death, Dempsey, who knew him as well as anyone, claimed the old dealer from the Klondike left a lot less. Dempsey said, Tex was my best pal for 12 years. His word was better than a gold bond. He never went back on it. Later in 1929, the year Rickard died, Dempsey lost roughly $3 million in the stock market crash, just like Benny Leonard did, who had also been wiped out by the Wall Street collapse. Estelle, who was still making movies during the last few years of their rocky marriage, was able to support her husband during this turbulent time.
Yeah, God, so many people lost their money, and it's interesting because Leonard and Dempsey both looked after their money and they invested it towards the end. Dempsey did as well, and for that to happen is just it's a great shame. But Dempsey, at the age of 35, did come back, but not as a professional. He fought almost 200 exhibitions across the country, sometimes as many as four in one night, and winning almost all of them by a knockout, usually against the local amateurs. The exhibitions actually earned Dempsey $200,000, and he then fought high-ranking heavyweight King Fish Levinsky in Chicago in 1932 at the age of 39, while considering a return professionally. Levinsky, one of the better of a poor lot of heavyweight contenders around at the time, easily blocked most of Dempsey's punches and found the old former world heavyweight champion easy pickings during their 4-round bout. Realizing that he had nothing left, the exhibition ended any thoughts of Jack Dempsey ever making a comeback professionally. Over the next 7 years, Dempsey appeared in several movies and refereed endless boxing and wrestling matches. As a boxing referee, Dempsey was well known to be lenient. If a young fighter turned to him to complain about an opponent's roughhouse, even foul style of fighting, Dempsey was apt to say to the complaint that never mind that, son, let's just keep fighting and have ourselves a nice little fight. There was a few, there were so many stories of him as a referee. I think over hundreds of fights he refereed. The money Dempsey actually earned, especially from his exhibition bouts, was enough to put him back on his feet, and he was financially able to purchase a restaurant on 8th Avenue across from the third Madison Square Garden, the third built Madison Square Garden, in 1935, which later was then moved to west side of Broadway in Times Square, where it remained open until 1975. Dempsey apparently would greet starstruck customers at the door, where he basically sat near this large window, the large window in the front window. He'd sit there in his little seat and he'd literally greet everybody. And if he knew a patron well, he would personally lead them back to their table. I mean, it's incredible. In between, he managed to actually finally enlist in the Coast Guards in 1942 at the age of 47, after initially being rejected by the army because of his age. So he finally got enlisted, Sean.
Well, years later, referring to his wartime experiences in the Coast Guard and the slacker charge that had been directed at him during World War I, Dempsey said, "They said I was a slacker in World War I and a hero in World War II. They were wrong both times." Dempsey and Estelle, well, they divorced in 1932 after 5 years of marriage. His third marriage, to Hannah Williams, a singer, lasted 10 years. It also produced Dempsey's only children, 2 girls, Joan and Barbara. Dempsey married a 4th time in 1958 to Deanna Piatelli, the owner of a Manhattan jewellery store whose daughter, Barbara Lynn, he adopted. It was the happiest of his 4 marriages, which lasted until his death following several strokes at the age of 88 on May the 31st, 1983. But rather than end this story with Jack Dempsey's passing, we will end it the same way the Dempsey movie ends, which we would recommend, and it's on YouTube if you haven't already done so. It's not too bad of a watch. The movie ends with Dempsey having a brief reconciliation with Jack Doc Kearns at a diner in New York on January the 30th, 1950, at which Dempsey was honoured by the Associated Press as the greatest fighter of the half-century, and at which Kearns was an honoured guest. Forgetting at least for the night that Kearns had harassed him for years with legal claims and had kept around half of his earnings until their split in 1926, Dempsey told the assembled guests that he was grateful to Kearns, and in his words he said, "for making me a champion," and for earning him $1 million. Kearns in turn told the audience that everybody has always known that my heart belonged to Dempsey. That comment took a lot of people, including Dempsey, by surprise. Nevertheless, Dempsey and Kearns shook hands warmly. Dempsey said more than a quarter of a century later, "As of that night, I forgave Doc for a lot of things, even though I could never forget." And that, folks, is the end of the Jack Dempsey career profile, the main story. And I suppose this is where we get to put our final thoughts, feelings and opinions on this whole story. Now we've done sort of back-to-back episodes in a way with Jack Dempsey being involved, as in the Legendary Nights finale and then this career profile. What I have learnt from this episode, Johnston, is that Jack Dempsey, there was reasons why people considered him to be one of the greatest of all time. It was for his fighting style, it was for his character, his charisma as an individual, and I'm very surprised that and delighted to know that regardless of what people felt about him at the time, thinking he was a slacker and a draft dodger, that it hasn't really affected his longevity in the history of this sport, because this is why we're doing a career profile on him, because he's considered one of the greatest of all time, certainly one of the greatest heavyweights of all time, and he stands the test of time. So the stories that we've told about the issues of the getting into the enlisting within the army and then ends up, having issues from that side, people thinking he's a draft dodger and a slacker, and, the fact that he then tries to get himself into the army at the age of 47, but he gets into the Coastal Guard instead. To me, it just indicated that need for him to want to say, at least I tried my best, and this time I actually succeeded in getting there. So nobody could call him a slacker at that point, but I think that definitely was something that must have hung over him for all of his life, completely all of his life, and that's kind of the interpretation I got from that element of his life. But I've enjoyed telling different parts of his story, some of which we told for the Legendary Nights episode, but more of them which we didn't cover, which was great to cover for this one. More details about the early days of his life, how he got into boxing, of course, in the aftermath of his boxing career, and some of the stories in between, more detailed stories between him, Tex Rickard, Doc Kearns. There's some great stories in this episode which really made me warm more to Jack Dempsey as an individual as well as a boxer, and I've personally learnt so much from covering Jack for the 2 episodes that we have done, and I hope that everybody listening, Johnston, has also enjoyed it just as much as me.
Yeah, I have too. One thing with the Legendary Night, we do touch on certain things, but we've elaborated more on his career profile. So, we wanted to touch on them, and then it's been nice to be able to elaborate on those stories in this and then add some new ones in there. I mean, the fact he was this young boy, he was a traveller, his family, his dad taking him everywhere. We're taking the whole family from one place to another, one state to another. They never settled. So it was no surprise that you realise that Dempsey becomes basically a hobo, but a working hobo. And that's one thing he always made sure he said, I was a working hobo. He never was the bum of the hobos. And, those how dangerous riding them rods were. I mean, we went into that with McCoy's, didn't we? Charles Kid McCoy's darker side of boxer side, and how dangerous that was. I mean, there was even other stories where he got beaten to the point where he almost got beaten to death once when he got caught by one of the guards while riding the rods as well, which was on a documentary on YouTube. Look, there's so much information out there. And how long has this gone on? I think this is near on 2.5 hours, maybe even more. So, unless we want to take it to another level, we could quite easily do that, because there are endless stories. Just want to point people to the direction of, the Jack Dempsey book, his autobiography. 100%. If you haven't read that, go and read that. The film isn't that bad. And a lot of this stuff we've gone through is there. I can't remember when it was made. It's in colour, but it's actually quite decent. And as you say, Sean, I think the one thing is, the crazy thing about his time as a fighter was his quick rise. It's almost like Rocky Graziano, how he just has a fantastic year. I mean, his knockout, it was impressive, the knockouts in that 1918, I think it was. But before that, he had ups and downs, and Doc Kearns was a huge part of that, although he was a dodgy character. And the Georges Carpentier fight, I'll tell you what, mate, I think that is almost a banker for our new Legendary Night episode, because the amount, I mean, the Cuban story is hilarious. I mean, I was wetting myself laughing while reading that story. I just pulled out a couple of waiters, dressed them up as Cuban, made them look rich, put a couple of Cuban cigars in there, and tried to trick Tex Rickard into thinking that they were multi-millionaire investors. I mean, it's just brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. And Doc Kearns is a real character. He outdone Dempsey there, though. He really did. I can understand why he said he can forgive, but he never forget. 100% with that, or not. You will forget, not forgive. I don't know whatever the expression is, but yeah, I mean, look, one thing I'm rabbiting on, but it is a great story. I mean, this hobo basically. A working hobo turns into a world heavyweight champion. I mean, you can't get better than that, can you?
It's a great story. A fantastic way to introduce Jack Dempsey to the audience. And, you know, like you've just pointed out, Johnston, you know, there are many other stories that we could have included for this. And you might think, well, why didn't you include them for this? And I think it's for the fact is that, you know, when we do these episodes, we want you as listeners to listen to this and go, you know what, I want to learn more about Jack. And that's kind of what the purpose of this is all about.
Exactly.
You know, if we was to do a full and complete episode on every single individual fighter, you know, we'd have to do it in parts 2, 3, maybe even 4 to be able to provide all that level of detail. It would be practically like dissecting autobiographies after autobiographies to be able to do that. So what we're trying to do is give you that element of mystery so that you will go out there and you'll read these books and you will check them out and you will be able to then read some of the other stories that have not been included for the episodes that we've covered on Jack so far, where it is nice. I like it when I learn something I didn't already know about a fighter or a fight or a build up to a fight or an aftermath. You know, when you read about these details years after the fact, it is quite enlightening to understand and appreciate this information. So I hope that what we've done is give you a good breadth of snippets of information about his life and his career that will then make you go out and do your own, you know, Jack Dempsey night, where you just sort of really read a book, or you do a documentary, or you do the film or whatever, and you know, you just take him in for what he was and appreciate him for what he was. So I hope we've been able to put that sort of perception across to you about who he was as an individual and his boxing career, and you know, some of the smaller detail in there as well. And for us, it's been a personal pleasure to do, as it always is. And if you have enjoyed it, the key thing to do here is to let us know if you've enjoyed it, or if you feel there were things that we could have included, or there's bits of information you know think would be good in the future to cover on him. Let us know at career_profiles on Twitter, or if you want to just give us a tweet at BTR Boxing Pod, or any of the BTR Boxing Podcast pages on social media, which is YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, even TikTok. If you want to shout us on there and give us a conversation around Jack Dempsey or anything to do with the story, you can do it that way as well. Please make sure you left us a rating and review on Apple if you've subscribed to Apple Podcast. Let us know your thoughts on any particular episodes, or just the Career Profiles podcast in general. And a big shout out to the patrons of the podcast network. You've had early access to this episode and ad-free access to this episode, so we hope you've been able to appreciate this episode without interruption in its entirety. If you're not a patron and you're in a position where you would like to support us, and you can support us, then please go and check us out at patreon.com/BTR Boxing Podcast Network. On there you'll find all the available membership tiers to allow you to be able to decide what level of membership you would like with the BTR Boxing Podcast Network. Any little bit of support is greatly appreciated, and it really does allow us to go out there and source more information, get the books, get the newspaper articles. You know, it doesn't come for free. You do have to pay out for some of this stuff, so any of them outlays do get paid for by the Patreon money that comes in. So we genuinely appreciate it. You help facilitate us even more to be able to complete more of these types of stories. So thank you to you guys, and thank you to everybody that's been listening to this episode. Thanks as always for listening to the Career Profiles podcast, and you've been listening to the Career Profile of Jack Dempsey.